complicated some of this stuff is, and how big a responsibility it is to be a board member. A board member is a public official. You aren't elected, but you're a public official, and a lot of the same rules apply to city council members and the mayor apply to y'all. But we do try to make these interesting, we stay very current. We're here to talk about what y'all want to talk about. Two subjects tonight, special request or bonds. I've never had a request from the party board members to talk about bonds, because most people think it's boring. We used to train that, and we still do for really advanced classes. We talk a lot about what's called bonds for title, which are the structure used for property tax savings, and we see a lot of those in Georgia. So I've tried to cover what you need to know, particularly the stuff that you don't see that's going on behind the curtain. And we've got some war stories to tell you about some of those things, so I think you'll enjoy it. The second presentation is on open meetings and open records and ethics and board member liabilities. This is normally presented by my partner, Kevin Brown, who's covering an emergency for an authority out of town today. So Kevin sends his regards but can't be here. However, his presentation is. And that'll be the second part of this. Technical breaking gets the topic, so you don't get too much too soon. But we usually get more questions about this because it concerns the board members individually. It's not just what the authority has to do, but what the board members are subject to. So I think you'll find that interesting as well. So with that, I guess we're ready to go. So I'm told that we're going to be able to start the presentation, and I can just sit here and click it. And is this mic working? Oh, it is working. Can y'all hear me pretty good? Mm-hmm. All right, let's give it a go. So Bonds 101. You know, I studied German at Emory. I don't know why, but if you studied a foreign language, you know you have to get to 101 or the rest of it will never make any sense to you. So that's where we start. And there you are. So a DDA has exactly 7 members. A citywide authority, a statutory authority, can have between 7 and 9. DDA has exactly 7, and if you count, you'll see 7 people up there. And there you are looking at what you normally get to see in a bond transaction. And the purpose of this is to explain that a little better and then tell you about some things that you don't see but that are very important. So this chart here, I'm going to have to come closer so I can see it myself. I'll get you started on this. This is the, wait a minute, I'm away from the mic. So you can take this. Okay. Can I pick it up? Boy, I feel like Frank Sinatra or somebody. All right, the bond process, up there where it says start. Somebody wants some bonds, and immediately following this part of this, we'll tell you about the kinds of bonds and what they do. So we're assuming somebody wants some bonds, and we'll explain to you in a minute why they may want some bonds. But this is what it goes on, and this is mostly visible to you as board members. The board only meets 2 times in the course of the whole process, but it's important. So you start up at the top with an application, and that's where somebody comes in with a form and says, I'd like some bonds, and here's a description of the kind of bonds I want, and here's something about us and something about the project. So question number 1 is, do y'all have an application? Don't worry, if you don't have one and want one, we can provide one for you. But that's normally where these deals start, so you know who you're talking to and what they're talking about. If we're talking about tax-exempt bonds, and a bond is a bond, but all bonds are not tax-exempt. That's up to the federal government. We usually start with a tax questionnaire to determine whether or not this bond that somebody thinks is tax-exempt really is tax-exempt, because they're not automatically tax-exempt. You don't want to start down this path, putting people to trouble and having them run up costs and then discover late in the process something you could have discovered up front, which is this bond ain't going to be tax exempt. So that's how it starts. Then the board is usually called on to adopt an inducement resolution, which is a relatively short document. It indicates the intention of the authority to issue the bonds. It's not final and it's not binding, But it's an important document because it means there's a potential deal here, and for federal income tax purposes, if the bonds are supposed to be tax exempt, you need one. So we usually prepare those on behalf of the authority, so it's an authority document. We know what's in it, and we know the right stuff is in it. The board meets, considers it. If it meets the board's approval, you approve the inducement resolution, and all that means is we keep going. If these bonds are going to be funded, then we've got to have a bond buyer, or usually credit enhancement. I mean, very few bonds, very few revenue bonds issued by a development authority, and very seldom publicly are they sold just on the strength of the company itself. It's not sold on our strength, the strength of the authority. Usually not sold on the strength of the city, and we'll talk about contract revenue bonds in a minute. So unless a bank is buying these bonds directly, and the bank will do their own due diligence, then the bank's being asked to provide a letter of credit to make sure that the bond investor get paid. And what do you put in the bond documents? Well, you have to put in there what the bank requires. So if these bonds are going to be funded, you need to know what the bank requires, so you need that term sheet. When you get that, you move over to the next box where we prepare the bond documents. We're usually bond counsel representing the authority. And, you know, as I said, the inducement resolution was like that. Bond documents are like this. They're a big stack of documents. We prepare them, we send them out. People read them sometimes, provide comments. We get them finalized. We come back to the board, stand in front of you, and say, this is the final bond resolution. If you approve this, we start the validation process, and the bonds will end up being issued. Do you have any more questions? We will tell you that the deal is or isn't the same as it was when we were in for the inducement resolution. We'll tell you that the authority is protected and indemnified, that your fees are provided for, and either recommend from a legal perspective that the board approve it, but it's up to y'all to do that, or tell you that if for some reason there's an unresolved issue and we feel like it would be a mistake for the authority to do it, then we'll tell you that. But by the time you get to that stage, almost invariably the documents are ready to go. So the board, if it meets your approval, will vote to approve. DDA, a vote can be just a majority of a quorum with two exceptions. One exception is designating something to be a project, and the other is issuing bonds. Then it takes a majority of the whole board. So a majority of the whole board is 4. If only 4 people show up and only 3 people vote for it, the motion fails at that point. I've seen that happen. So if the bond resolution is approved, then other things begin to happen. These are bonds to finance private business usually, so they're private activity bonds. The federal tax law requires a hearing called a TEFRA hearing. And at that point in time, we will have, in a prior stage, you see down at the bottom, we run an ad at least 14 days in advance of the hearing. The board could meet as a body and let the public provide comment, or it could send a hearing officer, which is what you normally do, and that's usually one of us. And it's not a debate, not a question and answer session. It's for the public to come and say, we either like this deal or we don't, and almost never do they come, and if somebody comes, it's because they don't like the deal. I mean, that happens sometimes when it's a recycling project or something that somebody just doesn't like. That's when people may come and make their comments. And what's the significance of that? We make a record of that, and we send it, in this case, to the city and say, this is the minutes of the TEFRA hearing. These federal income tax law says these bonds won't be tax exempt unless you elected people say so. So here's what the public has to say about it. And then if the city votes TEFRA approval, then we're able to proceed. With that, we will begin the validation process. Aaron will tell you all about that. But Georgia is one of 20, 30 states that require a judge to rule that the bonds are valid so that they can't be contested later on. So whatever we do goes before a Superior Court judge, and that judge hopefully will issue a validation order. If there's an intervention, it'll almost always end up on appeal to the Court of Appeals of the Georgia Supreme Court, and we'll show you an example of that later in the presentation. So that process has begun with us going to the district attorney, filing the notice that the authorities adopted a bond resolution, and on his behalf going to the Superior Court clerk and filing the package and getting publication dates and all. And there's more to it than that, which Aaron will tell you about. There's an ad that runs in the paper twice in different weeks. So one time in each of 2 different weeks. Here it's the Fulton Daily Report. So 1 week the ad runs. While this is going on, we distribute the closing documents. And since these are, in this example, private activity bonds, this requires an allocation of what we call volume cap. The federal government limits the amount of tax-exempt bonds that can be issued in the states to keep, because the IRS likes money. If they're tax-exempt, they don't get any money, so they try to hold that down. And there's an allocation divided up among the states, and in Georgia, the Department of Community Affairs controls that. It's competitive. So if we get the allocation, we can keep going. And in this example, the second ad runs. We have the hearing. Hopefully it lasts a minute and a half, unless the judge used to be a district attorney, and when he was a district attorney, he had some bond deals, and he likes to walk down memory lane with you. That's happened to me. But usually the judge will just validate the bonds. Then we're cleared to close, and we can, and this used to be a big deal. People used to, when a city or a county issued bonds, they'd go to New York and have a big party, and folks don't do that anymore. Development Authority bonds and DDA bonds aren't like that anyway. So, and we don't even usually have an in-person closing. Usually we exchange signature pages. Aaron, bless his heart, will go get all that stuff and make sure it's right. Then we close, the bond's delivered to the bond purchaser, and the bond purchaser funds the bonds, and the borrower, our project, gets the money and goes and spends it on the project. So that's a lot, but, and we can have questions about it all you want to, but I've got some more. Aaron, are you ready?
Sure.
This is really interesting, and some of it, we've got, how many bonds did we validate today? Was it 2?
Yesterday we did.
Yesterday, 2.
And validation, 1 in Cobb and 1 in Fulton County.
And the Fulton Superior Court clerk changed the rules on us on one of them. So, Aaron, take it away.
So what we'll do, Mike, if you can get me to that calendar on the validation process, and we're going to use the same slide that Dan used, but we're going to pick up where the board meets to adopt the bond resolution. The one on validation process? Oh, go to the bond process. So when we look at that bond process, we're going to pick up, I've scratched out 5 of the starts that Dan alluded to. So when we look at the bond, how the board meets, like theoretically, we meet today. So you're meeting today on March the 27th. What I would do, come in, and let's say the board approves the deal, say it's the ABC company. I would come in, I would meet with the chairman and the secretary, and they would sign the bond resolution and the verification, the acknowledgement. I would gather those things to prepare the petition and complaint. But one thing I want to go back, go to slide 2, Mike, please. Oh. Yeah, we're on your.
Well, there
okay.
you go.
So when you look at that calendar, that's kind of like the holy grail for us, what we need. We're on that financing schedule that we call it. So before we can get to the point of when we meet with the board on the 27th to have everything approved, we have to send what you call the MOA, Memorandum of Agreement, to the Fulton County Board of Tax Assessors. Now it's a process where they have to review it, and we have to have it to them 10 days prior before their meeting. So if Dan comes and say, okay, the authority would like to close on May the 8th and 9th of 2024, what I have to do is go in and look at that date and work my way backwards up to where we need to meet as an authority. And so what I would do then was, okay, we get to the 19th, and we're going to jump to March the 19th. Once the documents, as Dan explains, are done and everything is situated, we're going to send, we want to make sure that the authority has the documents a week ahead to review. So if you have any questions, it can be brought up in the meeting. And then we hold our breath on the 21st to make, hopefully, that the Fulton County Board of Tax Assessors will approve everything. And now that's where it gets us to that 27th, where once again I gather those documents and say, okay, we're moving forward. So when I leave the meeting that night, I'm going home to try to make sure, well, I've already tried to proof, and well, not try, but proofed everything, put together everything as far as our memo to get ready to send it to the district attorney's office, which is, usually we deal with Kevin Armstrong. He's the ADA down there at Fulton County. So we send it to him in Fonnie Willis' office. And so once we get it to him, if you can move to the next slide for me, Mike, of April. That's April, April 24th. Okay, just click up. Thank you. So here's what we need to do. So when I send it on the 28th, the district attorney requires about a week. So we try, and that's working days. So if I get it to him on the 28th, we'll look to get it back on the 8th or so. Sometime I send a reminder email. He say, oh, okay, Aaron, I'll get it to you. So during that time, before I can obtain those signature pages from the district attorney office, I need to get on the phone because I know I have a date for the petition to be filed, which, as you look at it, would be the 10th. But one of the caveats there, when you think about the hearing date, once I file that petition, I have 20 days from the date of filing the petition to get before the judge, which drops us to April the 29th and 30th to get the validation hearing before a judge. So in that time, what's taking place, I'm going online, I'm calling the judge's office, I'm meeting with the staff attorney, letting them know, hey, we need this date, can we get in on the judge's calendar? So in between that, what we just found out that just happened this year, we know that the Fulton County Daily Report is no longer the legal organ for Fulton County. It's South Fulton Neighbor. And see, unlike Fulton County Daily Report, they printed every day. So now you have one day to get your ad to the paper. So once again, we got to fit into those schedules. So it's so important that when I get those, it's a timeline that I got to meet. So being what you have here, what I gave an example as, once I file the petition, not only do I got to file the petition on the 10th, I got to get it to the newspaper, I got to get the rule NISI signed by the judge, and get everything filed with the clerk, the notice to the public, the rule NISI, the order to the judge, and get everything filed, and then we are complete. So that point will be done. And so in the interim, while those things are happening, I got on the 12th, I just put it in a calendar form for you. I'm sending to the company the acknowledgement of service because we got to now get those ready for them when we get prepared for the answers. And so as you look on the 15th and 16th, go ahead, sir.
This is board is not in this picture. This is all has to do with your firm, right?
Well, it has to do with the validation process.
Yeah, the validation process. So we wouldn't be tracking that. You would be tracking all of that.
Right, we'll be tracking that, absolutely, correct.
Okay, got you.
So yeah, so we're gonna handle that part for you. We're just showing you the
process.
Basically, we're behind the curtain on this part where I come
gotcha.
in. Dan has gotten you to that point where you have approved it and the board is okay.
Got it.
And so now we're moving forward,
Okay, I got it.
okay? Any other questions? I'm sorry.
No, I was just wanting to understand that this is actually, you're running us through the actual process.
Yes, ma'am.
of how the systems flow.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, yeah.
Okay. So as we get to that point, on the 15th and 16th, we also have to coordinate with the issuer. So what we'll do when I mean the issuer, the authority, or the board member, the chairman, and the secretary, we have a number of documents that we have to get executed. So all the documents that were approved at the meeting on the 27th, the secretary and the chairman will sign, and we would need to have it sealed. So those are one of the components we would come back that they would have to sign in our behalf. And then so we would reach out to the company. They would do the same thing on the company behalf, getting everything signed and back to us. So while we're in that process, our first ad on the 17th will run. So we've made that compliance. We hit that mark. So the ad has run for that first run. So now we have the 24th. So we might have that lull that week, but we're doing a few other things, trying to get ready. I'm preparing the answers, getting the answers back from the company so that once that second ad run on the 24th, I can file the answers on the 26th. And see, everything with Fulton, unlike some other cities, we can do like Cobb does Peach Court, where I can file online. But everything I have to do with Fulton, I have to go down to the courthouse. And we have to do in person. So that's kind of, a daily track. So like I had to get ready for the two validations we had yesterday, I drove to Cobb at 10:30 to help with the validation, and then drove to Fulton at 2:30 to do the validation. So those are but what I'm giving you is a snapshot of what we have to do in Fulton. So like yesterday, we met with Judge Ingram. So, and They have a great staff attorney. Her name is Allison Candler. And so we hit on that point. So we met yesterday, so we would meet on the 29th. So when you think about those 20 days from the date of filing, when we look back at the 10th, what I try to do is give us some wiggle room, because things can happen. So I'm trying to make sure I have 2 days. I don't like having one day after the weekend, because things can go awry, as we know. But so I always try to fit it in where I have something in that week when we get to that validation. So you have a Monday and a Tuesday. So that's how I try to base it off. So can we go to the next slide, Mike? Oh, the clicker.
You got the clicker.
Okay. Okay, there we go. So so now that we've done the validation, we've met before the Superior Court judge, as Dan brought out, it's really a 5-minute process unless that judge has a lot of questions or an intervener shows up. And sad to say, in Cobb, we had a guy that came numerous of times where he intervened on some of the things that was really unnecessary. It was popular for the county. It will be beneficial in economic development side, but he just had a personal vendetta, so to speak. And so when those things happen, it kind of puts the deal to sleep. And as Dan noted, we had one that had to go to the Superior Court that we had, and it was ruled in our behalf, and to more of that, we really set the tone. Trying to put it in a nice way, was kind of tapped on the hand a little bit for some of the what took place. So, but those are kind of some of the things that you run into. Like I found out yesterday that we have a new clerk of Superior Court. Her name is Miss Alexander. And so now the process, when I turn in the answers, I have to turn in a cost bill, which we have to turn in for the clerk certificate, and what we have called a validation certificate. Both of these things validate the petition and complaint to say, okay, the clerk is now approved, it's done, and it's official. And so, but that validation certificate is what we need to have so that we can attach it to the bond, because at closing, the company is gonna want that bond, and we have to have those two things. So those are the two necessary components that we have to have when we go to that validation hearing. But that being said, that's one of the things that's changed. So now I have to have in mind, along with other things, okay, let me turn this in when I prepare and provide the answers for it. So that's kind of some of the caveats that's changed. Unlike Peach Court, I can just do it online and then meet with the clerk, Ms. Taylor, out in Cobb, and she'll sign it officially. I can just walk into her office. So those are some of the benefits out there in Cobb. But back to this last calendar. So now, this last week, now that we've had the validation, I want to move back. So once you have the two ads have run, we have to run it 2 consecutive weeks. And then you can hold the validation hearing the week after those 2 consecutive weeks. So now we've at the point where we're following up with Companies Council, trying to make sure that we have all the opinions, we have the certificates of insurance, that we have, they're in compliance with what the authority wants us to make sure that they're in agreement with. So those are the things that we do. We call it the due diligence. So what we try to have the authority, the company side to do is have everything to us that week, that Monday or Tuesday, so that we can do our checklist. And I work with 2 other great paralegals that we work together as a team, and we just we knock it out. And so then that's when we get to the point, May the 8th and 9th, when Dan has said, okay, we want to close that deal. So we have the pre-closing on the 8th, and we close it out. And then, we just want the authority to look at their bank record when the Treasury come in and say, look, they did a great job. So that's our goal, not only doing a diligent job, but making sure that the authority is getting to the point where they can grow as a city. And so that's what you have with the bond validation process that we have to go through. Mr. Homer?
So your process is with the contractor and the city, making sure everything is legally done and comply.
That's absolutely correct. We're your attorneys. We are responsible for the documents being correct and the process being correct.
So when we approve a bond, we signing off that everything's been done appropriately according to the standards.
The authority has the responsibility to do a good job of approving and issuing bonds. The authority does not have liability for the repayment of the bonds. These are revenue bonds. But the board members and the authority have responsibilities. I mean, to authorize, you'll see more about this when I get into the types of bonds that can be issued. So we couldn't start to issue a single-family housing bond because we don't have that power. There are other examples where somebody might come to us, a developer or a company, and want financing, and something about it looks wrong to us. I mean, we've had folks want to issue what are called junk bonds, high yield, unrated bonds in retail denominations, sold to widows and orphans that shouldn't be buying that stuff. And I've had to take it on myself once or twice to say, all right, we got to get a financial advisor to look at this. And when that has happened, those folks have withdrawn the application. So it's our job to make sure that the law is followed and the documents are correct, that the authority is protected and the board members are protected. Yes.
That's my point. That's what I want to know. Thank you.
So y'all know a lot of stuff now that most authority board members don't know. There's a lot that goes on behind that curtain. So with that, Mike, if we could start back on my presentation. I've got another flow chart. This work for me? Yeah, look at there. So I'll walk up here on this one too. I'm kind of a nerd. I like Excel and I like charts and stuff. So this is a process chart. You see the guy holding the newspaper. That's an important thing. For a long time, it wasn't widely realized that a citywide authority or a DDA could basically do anything that a statutory citywide or countywide authority could do. So this DDA can do the same deals that the Development Authority of Fulton County can do, for example. Just because you can do something doesn't mean you should, but sometimes there are reasons for a city or a DDA to want to take control of their own destiny and do their own deals, and more that's happening. But, you know, we have to begin with the idea that that this DDA can do these things that we're talking about. And this is the process. Aaron mentioned the memorandum of agreement and the assessors. That's important when the bonds are being sold to provide property tax savings, property tax abatement it's called. The assessors aren't involved. If we're going to sell bonds and we're just going to loan the money to the company and we don't take title, there's no abatement and there's no involvement on the part of the Board of Assessors. Not every county involves their assessors. We have 159 counties and 159 different ways of doing things in the state of Georgia. And as Aaron has given you a flavor for some of the uniqueness that we encounter in Fulton County, but the local way of doing things is the local way of doing things, and that's what you have to do. So in the process, the first slice of the pie up there was start. We create the bond and give it to the company. So now you understand where that bond comes from. We actually print the bond, and the chairman and the secretary signs it after we go through that process. It's issued to the company, and in an abatement transaction, that we exchange that bond for title to the project. That's what the assessor involvement is about, because if you've got title, that's where the property tax comes in. So you see in the second slice of the pie, the company's deeding the project over to the Development Authority, and we've got title to it. We don't pay property tax. We're a public body. But if you stop there, the company just gave up its project. It doesn't have the right to use it, and it doesn't have the right to get title back. So that doesn't make any sense. So the company's going to want a lease so they can use the project, and they're going to want a $1 purchase option so they can get the title back. Well, the lease is potentially taxable, and that's where the property tax abatement comes in. You have to be able to deal with that lease, and there are a couple of basic ways of doing it. In Fulton County, the county authority uses what's called lease evaluation, where the lease is taxable and you adjust the value. There's another way of doing that that's done sometimes and has been done a couple of times in Fulton County as well, which does not involve the assessors. But regardless, you've got to have the lease and you've got to have the purchase option. The lease also serves another function. Remember, I said The authority's not liable to repay these bonds. They're payable out of revenue, and the revenue comes from the company. Well, that revenue is the lease payments. So the lease is the source of the revenue. And you see there when we begin moving up from the 6 o'clock position, the company pays rent to the development authority and gets an equal amount back as a bond payment. Well, those cancel each other out. So you don't have to actually exchange money. It's a cashless transaction. The bond is funded with property. So the company continues to have concerns. They want to know that they can control things, that the authority's not going to sell the project out from under it. So we pledge to the company the authority's rights, and that's done in a security deed or an assignment and security agreement of control over the project. We retain the right to have our expenses paid, the right to be indemnified, the right to get the public benefit that we bargained for, which is usually jobs and investment. But that makes the company feel comfortable that they're not at the sufferance of the government, that being us. Then in the last slice of the pie, you've had a successful transaction. We provided the incentive of property tax savings. The company has built the project. They've hired the people. The abatement period is over. They give us back the bond, and we give them back the deed. And everybody shakes hands and goes home. That's a simplified version. What you see in this chart here is really just to focus on the parts of everything that you've seen before that have to do with what we call a bonds for title transaction, where the whole thing is about property tax savings. So that clear? All right, so let's move on to the next slide. Success stories. This is why we do the things that we do. So, manufacturing bonds. Manufacturing bonds are a type of bond that potentially qualify to be tax exempt under the federal income tax rules. This is an example out of Spalding County a few years ago. It was a textile mill, and it was a $15 million deal. And for tax reasons that I'll explain later, only $10 million of that could be funded tax exempt. So that was a tax exempt bond, and the rest of it was funded with a bank loan. And that left, excuse me, almost $6 million of property amount that was outside that bond that also wanted property tax abatement. So we had to issue a second series of bonds in that bonds for title structure. So you don't often present to a DDA or to a citywide authority on manufacturing bonds. They're rare these days. $10 million, which is the limit that can be tax exempt, is a lot of money to me. But when the law was written in 1980, when Reagan was president, $10 million was a lot of money. It's not so much now, so these bonds are rarer. But Fairburn has had recently a manufacturing project within the city. So it does happen that, and the city of South Fulton had one a few years ago. So you have occasions where access to manufacturing bonds, and maybe those bonds being tax exempt, is a real incentive, a real service that the DDA or the citywide authority can provide to the company. And y'all may have noticed that interest rates are going up. So the big thing about tax exempt interest is, since the bondholder doesn't have to pay tax on the interest, they get the same benefit with a lower rate of interest. You know, what they give up in interest rate, they make up by getting to keep the money and not paying taxes on it. So the higher that interest rates get, the more interest there is in tax-exempt bonds. And we are actually seeing some of that interest in the last couple of years, last year and this year. We're seeing more interest in tax-exempt bonds, including manufacturing bonds, than we have in 10 years, 10 to 15 years. So this is an example, real closing. This one is out of Clayton County. These are two affordable housing projects. These are low, technically under the tax law, they're called low-income housing bonds, but they're commonly called affordable housing bonds. These are a type of private activity bond. They take that volume cap from DCA that I mentioned. This was a fairly large transaction, and so these bonds were sold publicly, which also you don't see very commonly anymore, but as deal sizes grow, you might begin to see larger ones. So that's an actual affordable housing project, really two projects that closed in Clayton County. This is a interesting project. Another grounds for the bonds to be tax exempt is if the borrower is a federally recognized nonprofit, a 501c3. This is taking place in Cobb County. What you see quoted up there is the summary of the inducement resolution. That was, what month is this? This is March. So in the March meeting of the Development Authority of Cobb County, we adopted the bond resolution. What you see before that is in January when the inducement resolution was adopted. And you can look at that and see that the nonprofit, the Nobis nonprofit, is borrowing the money, and this was privately placed with a bank, Resonant Bank out of Mississippi, to acquire where the Cobb Chamber used to be and refit it to be an education and training center for folks with disabilities. So it's an extremely worthwhile project. The bond size, I can't see from here, but I think it was about $6 million. And it's a good project for a good cause. There are a fair number of 501c3 bonds in Union City. Not this year, but last year, we did three, actually the City Housing Authority did three housing bonds for National Church residences, which are pretty well known for senior affordable living. So there are opportunities there to help nonprofits through these 501c3 bonds. Contract revenue bonds, I'm going to get up so I can read what's up there. You know, this is near and dear to home in Fairburn because y'all just did one of these, and I've got an example from Forest Park coming up next. But as a way to explain what this is all about, really it's about the city avoiding a referendum. That's all it is. With a contract revenue bond structure, the city enters into an intergovernmental agreement with the DDA or the citywide authority, and the city agrees to provide millage from taxes to pay debt service, and that secures and repays the DDA or the citywide development authority's bond, and that money is funded by the bond purchaser, usually a bank, and it goes for city purposes. You'll see another city purpose in a minute, but what is the basis for this is that agreement between the city and the DDA or the citywide authority, and that's under the Georgia Constitution's Intergovernmental Agreement Clause, which authorizes contracts like that for up to 50 years. So sometimes you hear that a city council can't bind their successors. Well, yes, they can if they're binding their successors to an intergovernmental agreement, and that makes that project financeable and it makes that bond marketable. Basis for this is usually Code Section 48.5.350, which allows a city to pay up to 3 mills of taxes each year over to the citywide authority of the DDA, and you combine that. It's only 1.3 mills for both authorities as financial assistance to the authority, and that's a source of revenue that goes on the revenue bonds. The result is that you got some bonds that are marketable and interest rates and terms that are very good. And these are, you know, back in the day when I first started out, you didn't see these very much. You don't see them every day now, but they're pretty common. These are not uncommon at all for a city to do business with its citywide authority or its DDA this way. And the example, thank you, Aaron. This is from Forest Park. This is Forest Park's Main Street project that we closed last year with their DDA's bond council. This was a $6 million deal. That Nobis deal must have been smaller. And as you see, if you look in the second paragraph, this is the bond form. This is an actual bond that I took a picture of. The bond for this project. You see the interest rate, you see the term, the duration of the financing. And if you look in the second paragraph, you can see that it was to acquire properties to be used for restaurant, retail, and office space. So without getting in the weeds too much, actually, Aaron, if you'll go to the next slide, thank you. Back up. Let me think. No, it's 2 slides down. I'll hold that. and so let's move on with that. I want to get you to the, I'm confusing myself. Let me back this up. Yeah, it's on another slide. We'll get to it. I want to make a point about private projects and public projects. So development authorities and DDAs were created to finance private business. There's a loophole for public-private partnerships. When a city uses a DDA or a citywide authority to finance a project, it can't finance, for example, a new city hall. Union City tried that in the 80s, and the Supreme Court said you can't do that. That was the Odom case. What makes this work, and what makes it work for y'all, is that there are private use properties involved in this. This is a way to land bank. You know, you can acquire some property that you might need for a city administrative building down the line, but you're not doing that now. Right now, you're using it for restaurant, office, and retail. So that's something going on behind the scenes with this that I felt like I needed to explain. This is an example of where we have to be careful what projects we take. We have to make sure that the projects are legal. This is an example of a success story with the bonds for title for property tax abatement. This is out of Chamblee. And this whole deal was all about getting a Whole Foods grocery store. You know, I mean, some communities are food deserts where you don't have a grocery store at all. Others have a grocery store maybe, but they're trying to raise the community up, and they want a brand like a Whole Foods. So the DDA provided a long-term deep discount property tax savings program for the developer on the condition, and that's the memorandum of understanding, not an MOA, but a memorandum of understanding. An MOU is a deal document, and this deal says we're going to provide all of this abatement for you, but come heck or high water, you're going to keep a Whole Foods in there. It's got to be a Whole Foods, nothing else. And sure enough, the developer sold the project that year, and this was 4 years ago maybe. It was the largest commercial real estate sale of the year in Atlanta. So it was a huge success. And what do you think happened? New developer came in and said, I'd like to put another grocery store in there instead of Whole Foods. And we said, no, you can't do that. You can't do that and keep your abatement. So you can make a deal, and you can make a good deal, and if you're careful, you can enforce it. And that's another thing we'll help you with. So behind the curtain, more on what's going on behind the curtain. Here we go. So we've talked about the fundamental thing that you can only do what the law allows you to do, and that's state law. So there are two primarily important laws for authorities. You got the Downtown Development Authorities Law, which governs the DDA, and the Development Authorities Law, which governs the citywide authority. There are some other laws that will apply, and I'll mention those later. But the Downtown Development Authorities Law and the Development Authorities Law says that you issue your bonds, and they are revenue bonds, and you issue them to finance projects. So here's the definition. This is the court ruling that I mentioned earlier. This is the Odom versus the Union City Downtown Development Authority case, where they were trying in Union City, and this was in, what was that, 81, to finance a city hall and a jail, I think. And it got to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court says, yes, that you have the ability to finance projects and all kinds of commercial projects. So the power that was granted by the legislature under the Constitution to DDA was expansive. It was all types of commercial projects, so you've got that. And here's an example. Basically, it says you can do anything with any kind of real or personal property, which is, I mean, that pretty much covers it. And it talks about the purpose that you would do that. It can be for any industrial, commercial, business, office, parking, public, or other use. So that's about as broad as you can get, and that was intentional. Like the Supreme Court said, the General Assembly meant to tell development authorities, DDAs, I mean, that you can do any kind of project that is constitutional. Now, This was a case that Aaron alluded to earlier, where that tax activist in Cobb County attacked a grocery store. I don't know why it is that grocery stores attract so much attention. We had a Whole Foods already, now we got one of those big Krogers with music and book readings and all that kind of stuff. Tax activist didn't like it. He said the Development Authority's law did not allow it. Superior Court judge would not validate the bonds. We went to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court said you've got to validate these bonds, and that judge got, I wouldn't want the Supreme Court writing anything about me like I saw in that ruling. But what this means to a downtown development authority is this: the wording of that section in the Development Authority's law, that subsection N, is the same as that definition of project in the Downtown Development Authority's law. If we'd lost that case, and that was my firm that carried that Supreme Court and won. If we'd lost that case, then citywide and countywide authorities would have had their powers trimmed back a lot, but DDAs would have been out of business, because that code section is our only code section. It covers everything. But if we'd lost it, like office projects, for example, if we'd lost it, none of those. But we didn't lose. Now, going back to what I was looking for earlier, that we talked about the Odom case. You can't do purely public projects. And I got to tell you that history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. So the Odom in that case is Mrs. Odom, who was a resident of Union City back then and is a resident of Union City now. She's remarried, and that's not her name, but she's now on the board of the Union City Development Authority. So how about that? 30 years ago, she's suing the Development Authority, and now she's on the board. How about that? So you can't do a purely public project, but you can do a properly integrated public-private project. An example of that is a hotel with a public parking deck. You see things like that fairly often. So that's something that I don't think Fairburn has seen yet, but keep an eye out for it, because that's a way to do a public-private partnership. And it might be possible for the public portion of that to be supported by city millage without being subject to that 3 mills limit. That's another thing to think about. Now, we issue our bonds to finance projects so as to revitalize and redevelop the central business district of the city. That's our purpose, going back to keep us doing what it's legal to do. Well, you have to do what your purpose is. Every public body has a governmental mission. Our governmental mission is to revitalize and redevelop the central business district of the city. So what is the central business district? That's the same as a downtown development area, and it's what the mayor and council think constitutes the central business district. That's not extremely helpful, but it does confer a lot of discretion. And that's done by the mayor and council adopting a resolution designating it. That is part of your activating resolution when the DDA is created and allowed to operate. And it can be changed from time to time by amending that resolution, but you can't play games with it. This was a Superior Court case, and I heard about this a long time ago, and I can't find the case. I've tried. But the DDA was trying to provide some incentives across I think it was the Oak-Mulgee River, claiming that that was part of the central business district, and the judge who lived in the county said, no, it's not. So you got a lot of discretion, but you got to be reasonable. Yes, sir.
So, in this case, what you just mentioned, would a shopping center, a grocery store comply with the city rules and regulations too? Oh, okay. It would? Okay. With the crowd? Okay. Thanks. Yes.
Okay. Picking right up. Oh, I'm going to skip that. This DDA is created under the Downtown Development Authority's law. Some are created by amendment to the Georgia Constitution. You can't do that anymore. So here is what the potential jurisdiction of all the authorities that might do some business in Fairburn and in Fulton County, where their jurisdiction is. So our jurisdiction is the central business district. And jurisdiction expands as you go out from the center. This is a nested Venn diagram. So you see the central business district as the center, and that's us. And then you see the ring around that as the city. So that's the jurisdiction of the citywide authority. It's got jurisdiction inside the central business district and outside the central business district inside the city. If the city were to annex property, then the annexed property would automatically become part of the jurisdiction of the citywide authority. And, you know, there was one community that almost got some property de-annexed by the General Assembly, and if that had succeeded, then the citywide authority would have lost jurisdiction. It's automatic. There are some constitutional city authorities and DDAs that have, because of that amendment to the Constitution, you can't do it under the Constitution we've had since 1987. But under these older authorities, there are a few of them that are given jurisdiction outside the city. For example, the City of Canton Development Authority has jurisdiction for 5 miles from the center of the city. All county development authorities have jurisdiction everywhere in the county, including in the cities in the county. And that's a point of conflict every now and then between the City of Atlanta and Development Authority of Fulton County, but that's the way the law is. And then there are a handful of constitutional city authorities that have jurisdiction, believe it or not, countywide. The one in Carroll County does, and I'm trying to think of another one, but I know that one does. So that's your jurisdiction there, and those are the other authorities that you might bump into in the central business district that also have jurisdiction there. That's the point I made earlier, that it's not a recent trend, but the cities and are beginning more and more to want to have their own development authorities do their own deals because they're closer to it. And a lot of them feel, and I'm not necessarily talking about Fulton County, but there are a lot of cities and communities around the state that feel ignored by the countywide authority. If the countywide authority is the one that's historically done economic development and you've got a downtown problem, that historically industrial countywide authority is not going to pay much attention to it. So there are reasons for it. I mentioned these other state laws. I won't get into them. I will say I wrote the Pilot Restriction Act. I had to. I was asked to do it by a legislator. That deals with how payments in lieu of taxes are paid and how they can be used. Now, I'm not going to bore you to tears with getting into federal income tax law in any detail, but just enough to know that if you want a tax-exempt bond, there's some work to be done. So it's automatic if one of our bonds issued here in Georgia pays interest to a Georgia taxpayer. The state of Georgia doesn't impose state income tax on that interest. But that's all that's automatic about it. Under the federal income tax law, you've got to have an exemption, and when the tax law was changed in the 80s, only a few exemptions were preserved, and those have been basically narrowed ever since. And here's the basic thing. You start with the premise that if you're a governmental body and you issue bonds, they're going to be tax exempt unless there's too much private use and too much private payment or private security, blah, blah, blah. I mean, our DDAs and our citywide authorities interact with the private sector. You can expect private use. So our bonds are normally going to be private activity bonds subject to these rules. Here are a couple of the exemptions that we might bump across. I mentioned that textile mill in Spalding County. I'm not even going to read all that stuff to you. These are the primary hurdles that you have to jump over if you want a manufacturing bond to be tax exempt. So no wonder there's not many of them anymore. It's not as bad with 501c3 bonds for nonprofits, that you don't need an allocation of volume cap from Department of Community Affairs. If they get started on something and realize they didn't come in and get their inducement resolution like they were supposed to, the federal tax law recognizes that they may have adopted, their board may have adopted a resolution that counts as an inducement resolution. So there are a fair amount of these 501c3 bonds being issued tax exempt. They're not as hard to do. Anatomy of a bond issue, there's the closing. And these are questions, I'm winding this up now, we're almost done with this presentation. These are questions that we get asked a lot. I mean, how long does it take and who is involved? So the bonds for title for abatement, I mean, I say 4 to 6 weeks. We'd never be able to get one of those done in 4 weeks these days, certainly not in Fulton County. So you can say 60 to 90 days. But the cast of characters is small. It's the company and the development authority and the 2 sets of lawyers. So it's not the end of the world. Private placement, like where a bank buys the bond, 6 to 8 weeks, and the only new characters are the bank and their counsel. Public offering, 60 to 90 days. These are really minimum numbers. I mean, I think those numbers are understated today. But it's an enormous cast of characters, and the transaction costs are high, which is why you don't see bonds being issued publicly unless they're in a relatively large amount, like that those Clayton County affordable housing deals that we saw. So how much does it cost? That's always something to know. I mean, one of Dan's rules for life, it's the job of the developer or the company to pay the costs. The development authority should not pay any costs. So they're interested in what those costs are, and we talk about that. And if property tax savings is involved, it's not just if you're both raising money and saving taxes, like the textile mill did in Spalding County. The costs are so much less important because you're getting both benefits, the capital that you're raising and the taxes that you're saving. And these are some rules having to do with the size, how big does a deal have to be before it makes sense? And these are for funded deals. Really, I think if somebody wants a tax-exempt bond, it ought to be at least $3 million, or the numbers aren't going to work. If they want a deal just for property tax savings, it really ought to be $10 million, but we've done them as low as $5 million. We've got a $5 million deal going on right now. So those are some parameters. And
Question,
yes, sir.
is the cost of the bond based on credit reporting?
If the bonds are funded, the interest rate has to do with the creditworthiness of the company. If you're talking about the transaction costs, and a budget would include the cost of authority counsel, bond counsel, which is authority counsel, the development authority's financing fee, and we'll see that in a minute. The company has to pay their lawyer. There's some of these costs associated, like paying for the ads. And what they want is to add all of those things up and say, I'm paying these amounts up front at closing, but I get my abatement over 10 years. So what's the time, taking the time value of money into account, what's the net benefit? And there are ways to calculate it like that. The net benefit is always large, but I mean, it's business. People ask what things cost, and they ought to. But it's not based on creditworthiness.
They can calculate that cost ahead of time.
Yes, sir. That's disclosed up front. Has to be. All right. Speaking of money, normally a DDA or development authority would get a financing fee for doing the deal, and normally that fee is 1/8 of 1% of the maximum bond amount. So if it's a $10 million deal, it's $12,500. And normally it's paid at closing. Now, what has been happening, and this isn't new news, what's been happening for a while now, is that the city authorities and the DDAs, where if you're charged with doing a transformational project, and that word's overused, and catalytic, that word's overused, but I've seen a lot of them over the years. I mean, sometimes you do have a project like that where you do something for them you wouldn't do for anybody else, and you wouldn't do it for them again. So it's a milestone project. It's going to change the city. You give them a long-term, deep discount abatement, and then you get to thinking, well, we the authority need some funding. I mean, this is all the money that we get to operate on in a lot of cases, unless you get financial support from the city. So increasingly in deals that stand out like that, the city authority or the DDA will charge maybe an annual financing fee, maybe an annual administrative fee, and board members should look at that. If you ever see a case like that where it makes sense to to gain share, I've heard a developer call it gain share, they're gaining, but they're gonna share some of the gains with the authority, then that's something that can be discussed. But the normal fees charged by the authority are what you see on the board there. Yeah, so if tax exempt bonds, it can't exceed 1/8 to 1%, but with taxable bonds, bonds for title, it can be whatever you can charge. And that's it. And if you have more questions, that's how you can find me. All right, so it's 5:17. Sylvia, you want to should we take a break? You want to launch into the open meetings, open records? What would you like to do?
So we're going to take a break, everyone to get something, get refreshed and get something to eat, and then we will start the Development Authority meeting properly at 6 o'clock. Okay. So that gives everyone some time to get some dinner, actually.